Stay tuned for urban legends to ghostly tales of the paranormal, because now it's time for
Message on the Wall.
This is Message on the Wall with a few eerie things you may not know about American presidents. One thing widely known is that it's a dangerous role, with some paying with their lives in being assassinated, along with those who narrowly escaped death. Andrew Jackson, the 7th President of the United States, was attending the funeral of Congressman Warren Davis in January of 1835 when Richard Lawrence attempted to shoot him. Carrying 2 derringers, both misfired. He was charged with attempted assassination, but found not guilty on the grounds of insanity, spending the rest of his life in an insane asylum. Abraham Lincoln was the first ever president to be assassinated, with his assassin John Wilkes Booth expecting to be seen a hero, but instead he was classed a monster. He was surrounded by soldiers, with one shooting him and causing his death. James Garfield was shot by Charles Ghetto on July the 2nd, 1881, but did not die until September the 19th due to blood poisoning. His assassin was convicted and hanged in May the following year. William McKinley was serving his 2nd term when he visited the Pan American exhibit in Buffalo, New York, where he was shot twice by anarchist Leon Czolgosz on September the 6th, 1901. The 25th president held out until September the 14th. His assassin was convicted and electrocuted the following month on October the 29th. On the death of President McKinley, Theodore Roosevelt, as vice president, took office. He then became president in his own right in the following election of 1904. After his 2nd term he withdrew, but then in 1912, after a fallout with his successor, William Taft, Roosevelt decided, quite late in the game, to run for the presidency, though he later withdrew on seeing that he couldn't win. It was while he was campaigning on October 14th that he was shot in the chest by a New York saloon keeper named John Shunk. Fortunately for Roosevelt, the 50 pages for his speech and his spectacle case got in the way, slowing down the .38 caliber bullet enough to just impact into his chest. He never had the bullet removed, and the wound healed over. Shunk spent the next 29 years in the Central State Mental Hospital until his death in 1943. Harry Truman also came in the line of fire when on November the 1st, 1950, 2 Puerto Rican nationals tried to shoot their way into Blair House, across the road from the White House where the president and his family were staying. In attempting to bring attention to the case for Puerto Rican independence, which today is still a US territory, it cost one of the men their lives, with security officers being injured in the shootout. The second was sentenced to death, which Truman commuted to life in prison, but in 1979, 29 years later, President Carter set him free. John F. Kennedy's assassination is probably the best known in US history, at the time being the youngest president to take office. It was on November the 22nd, 1963, while travelling in a motorcade through the streets of Dallas, that he was shot by one or more assassins, though a 1982 study and the FBI consummate the one gunman theory. Gerald Ford managed to escape 2 assassination attempts, the first on September the 25th, 1975, by one of Charles Manson's followers, Lynette Squeaky Fromm, who pointed a gun at the 38th president but did not fire. She was convicted of attempting to assassinate the president and was sentenced to life in prison. After serving 34 years, she was released on parole in August 2009. The second attempt was also by a female, coming 17 days later. Sarah Jane Moore was around 40 feet away from President Ford when she took her shot, but missed by inches, with the bullet hitting and wounding a taxi driver. Before she could shoot again, an ex-Marine, Oliver Sipple, dived towards her and knocked her arm, an act that certainly saved the president's life. Moore pleaded guilty and was sentenced to life in prison. After serving 32 years, at the age of 77, she was released on parole in 2006. And lastly, in March of 1981, Ronald Reagan's would-be assassin shot a number of rounds that left a bullet in the president's lung, with his press secretary, a security guard, and a police officer all being injured. John Hinckley Jr. had targeted President Reagan in a bid to impress actress Jodie Foster, who he was also stalking. Being found guilty by reason of insanity, Hinckley remains under institutional psychiatric care. All the successful assassinations have been put down to a curse that began with William Henry Harrison, who became the 9th president in 1840. It was noted that anyone who was elected in a year ending with a 0 was doomed to die in office. Harrison had only served 31 days when he succumbed to pneumonia and pleurisy. After Harrison, 6 more presidents were elected to the White House in a year ending with a 0. Abraham Lincoln came to his second term in 1860, James Garfield was appointed in 1880, and William McKinley in 1900, with all 3 dying at the hands of assassins. Warren G. Harding won the elections in 1920 and suffered a heart attack 881 days into his term. Then there was John F. Kennedy, who won the presidency in 1960. However, the curse seems to have been broken by Ronald Reagan, who, winning in 1980, survived his assassination attempt. Then there are the eerie coincidences between Presidents Lincoln and Kennedy. A list appeared shortly after Kennedy's assassination. I suppose some newspaper reporter was looking for something to write and began comparing the 2 most famous presidents of the United States. Both having been assassinated while in office gave them ties, and the list, which over the years has grown, binds them even closer together. It may just well be coincidence. Or is it? Of course, if you look for something, you're inevitably going to find it, and if not, then make it up. Though having said that, there are still a lot of coincidences between Lincoln and Kennedy and their tragic deaths. One link that was noted was that Abraham Lincoln was elected to the House of Representatives in 1846, and with 100 years parting them, John F. Kennedy was elected to the House in 1946. Both men became president with the year ending in a 0, bringing them under the curse. Again, 100 years separates the two, with Lincoln in 1860 and Kennedy in 1960. Both men were civil rights leaders. In 1863, Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation took effect, while Kennedy presented his report on civil rights in 1963 that led to the famous March on Washington. Something else that is often quoted is that Lincoln had a secretary named Kennedy, although there is no proof of this, but John F. Kennedy certainly did have a secretary named Evelyn Lincoln. Mary Lincoln and Jackie Kennedy both lost children while their husbands were serving at the White House. And then there are family names. 2 of Abraham Lincoln's sons were named Edward and Robert. Edward died at the age of 3 years old, while Robert lived to 1926, having followed his father's footsteps into politics. An interesting fact is that he was also in the vicinity when both James Garfield and William McKinley were assassinated. Only a short time before his father's assassination, Robert Todd Lincoln was on the platform at Jersey City train station. It was late at night, and quite a crowd had gathered to get their tickets for sleeping car places. While waiting his turn, he was jostled against a train car, and as it began to move, Robert was thrown off balance, and losing his footing, his legs began to slide down in the gap between the train and the platform. There is no doubt that he would have been killed if someone hadn't grabbed his jacket and set him back on his feet. Turning to thank his rescuer, he recognised the actor Edwin Booth, the brother of John Wilkes Booth, who was his father's murderer. Lincoln may have had two sons named Edward and Robert, while Kennedy had two brothers of the same name, Robert Kennedy, who was assassinated in 1968, and so having his life shortened, and Edward, who became a senator, dying in 2009. When it comes to the assassination, there are many strange coincidences. Both presidents were with their wives as opposed to Presidents Garfield and McKinley. Both were shot in the head from behind, and on the same day of the week, being a Friday. In Lincoln's case, it was a Good Friday. President Lincoln and his wife were watching a production of a play, Our American Cousins, when John Wilkes Booth entered the theatre box and at close range shot Lincoln. President Kennedy and his wife were touring Dallas when shots rang out, making people scatter as the president was shot by an unseen sniper a good distance away. Both assassins are known by 3 names, which when counted, both contain 15 letters. This is the same with the names Lincoln and Kennedy, both totaling 7 letters. John Wilkes Booth made his escape from the theatre and was soon chased to Maryland, where he hid in a tobacco barn, which I suppose could be seen as a warehouse. And if you believe that Lee Harvey Oswald assassinated Kennedy, as there are speculations that he didn't commit the crime, and if he did, he wasn't the only gunman that day. Oswald is said to have positioned himself in the Texas School Book Depository, which was the warehouse where he worked, and shortly after went to a movie theatre where he was arrested. So the coincidences being that Booth ran from a theatre to a warehouse, and Oswald ran from a warehouse to a theatre. A link between the two presidents is that Lincoln was shot at the Ford Theatre, and Kennedy, being in a motorcade, was seated in an open-top Ford Lincoln. It was 12 days after shooting Lincoln that Booth was found hiding in a barn. Refusing to come out, the barn was set on fire in an attempt to smoke him out, though he still refused, and in the mayhem was shot in the neck. He was dragged from the barn and died 3 hours later. Like speculations surrounding Oswald not being Kennedy's assassin, a story to set intrigue surfaced about Booth, with claims that he didn't die, but with the help of friends escaped and took on a new identity. Lee Harvey Oswald was arrested, and though he was interrogated, he denied that he had been involved in killing the president. No recordings were made, with transcripts of the interviews being destroyed. Oswald was being taken from the Dallas police headquarters via the basement to be transferred to the county jail amidst a throng of newspaper photographers, newsreel men and reporters when Jack Ruby stepped in front of the officers, ushering him to an armoured truck, shooting him at point-blank range. On the death of both presidents, their vice presidents automatically took over the presidential post to serve out the rest of the term. Both Lincoln and Kennedy's vice presidents were Southern Democrats, Both had served in the US Senate, and both shared the same last name. Andrew Johnson, who was born in 1808, became president on Lincoln's death, serving until 1869. Lyndon Johnson, who was born in 1908, took over office on Kennedy's death, being sworn in 99 minutes after the assassination, with a very shaken and upset Jackie Kennedy by his side. And those are some of the eerie coincidences between President Abraham Lincoln and President John F. Kennedy. You have been listening to Message on the Wall, brought to you in association with Paranormal Parodies. You can find Paranormal Parodies at paranormal-parodies.com.